Hello, my name is Sarah Paris and I'm a doctoral researcher in biological anthropology at the University of Cambridge. The title of this talk is Caught Red-Handed, a methodology for exploring the taphonomic process of ochre staining on bone. In this presentation, I would like to explore ochre-to-bone transfer in burial contexts through an experimental method. Before I start, I'd like to give advanced warning that this presentation contains images of human skeletal remains and animal remains. Ochre is a natural iron oxide mineral seen in many contexts, such as cave paintings and body paint, from the Paleolithic to the present day. Ochre research has historically focused on the meaning or use of ochre, and only recently has processing been considered. Ochre has been seen in burials from around 100,000 years ago. It appears in graves in two types, either nodules placed like artefacts or ground into a powder and sprinkled over the body. This image here is of two neonates from the Neolithic site of Kok Phnom D in Thailand. The individual on the left has extensive ochre staining encasing their bones. Compare that to the unochred individual on the right. So the research questions I wanted to tackle are whether the material to which ochre is applied, pre-deposition, affects the ochre-to-bone transfer seen in ochred burials, and can elemental composition of the soil samples determine the presence of ochre at a burial site when it is no longer visible. The experiment designed to tackle these questions compares ochre-to-bone staining through decomposition, applying ochre to different materials before burial. My variables were bone, skin, hair, and animal fur. The experimental design was influenced by decomposition experiments more commonly carried out in forensic anthropology. Decomposition has 5 phases: fresh, bloat, active decay, advanced decay, and skeletonized remains. During bloat, cells within the soft tissues break down and release hydrolytic enzymes. The skin becomes loose and gravity causes the skin to tear and slip from the rest of the soft tissue. This concept is called skin slippage. I have attempted to illustrate the effect this might have on ochre. Please forgive my drawings. On the left, we have ochre applied to skin. When skin slippage occurs, it takes the ochre with it. This has led me to hypothesize that ochre applied to the skin will leave a shadow of ochre around the remaining bone, with minimal to no ochre on the bone itself. Hair and fur take longer to decompose than soft tissue. When covered with ochre, it is also heavier, so the ochre is held together in a mass by the hair or fur. Once the soft tissue has decomposed, the mat of ochre and hair or fur directly gravitates downwards. This would cause the ochre to lie directly on top of the bone. Once the hair and fur have decomposed, this is more likely to cause the staining seen on archaeological remains. I decided to use pig as my human proxy, as it has proven to be the best animal comparison to human tissue. Ochre applied to pig bone was chosen as the control, with the variables of skin, human hair, and rabbit fur as a proxy for clothing or blankets. My samples were 18 pig legs, 3 just bone, 15 fleshed legs, untreated human hair, and 12 rabbit furs. The sample preparation: 25 grams of ochre was ground into a powder with a pestle and mortar and mixed with pig fat to make a paste. The weather was particularly cold at the time the experiments were carried out, so the ochre mixture solidified very quickly, making it difficult to work with. The solution was to keep the ochre paste in a bowl over simmering water to keep it malleable. This was applied to 3 samples of each: bone, skin, hair, and fur covering the pig leg, fur as a blanket underneath the pig leg, and fur as a blanket over the pig leg. The rest of this talk is very much about the things that worked and the things that did not, in the hope that if others use these methods, I can save them some of the mistakes that I made. So the burials. I didn't want to freeze the meat because of the micro changes it causes to the bone. so all 18 pig legs had to be prepared and buried on the same day. The area for burial was strung up the day before, creating a grid with 45cm square grave cuts, with space between them to minimise contamination between samples. Although, due to the limited space, I was aware that any severe animal action would potentially cause movement between the cuts. Soil samples were collected from each cut to enable geochemical sediment changes post-burial. But the best laid plans. I was aware that bad weather was forecast, and so I set up the tarpaulin to protect the area. But as you can see from the photograph, this did not survive the snowfall. I know we have a global audience, but for Cambridge it's quite unusual to see this level of settling snow. Nevertheless, the pigs needed to be buried, so the individual cuts were made. Winter limited the period of daylight, which meant the last few cuts were done by torchlight, and perhaps shallower and not as neat as I would have liked. I didn't prep the cuts the day before because the space was quite tight and I thought the narrow strips of sediment would collapse if the holes were pre-cut. With hindsight, I could have prepared alternate cuts the day before. The experiment was originally meant to be excavated 12 months later. However, my fieldwork abroad ended up delaying this by 8 months. The excavation began at the end of August 2019, taking 2 months. I'll explain in due course why it took so long. I also decided not to excavate them traditionally, as I wanted to block lift them and CT scan them in the hope of capturing the ochre and bone in 3D space, and thin section the blocks afterwards. So the first question is, how do you find them again? The pegs and nails had been left in situ, so I was able to restring the area quite easily. They had been buried at a set depth of 45cm. However, as aforementioned, those buried at the end of the day, in the dark, were not buried as deeply as they should have been. Scaled plan drawings of the burials also provided measurements for the positioning of the remains within the square cut. Nevertheless, this was extremely difficult. A trench had to be cut to the side of the first row of experiments, and the blocks had to be cut out sequentially in order not to damage the adjacent blocks. The soil was extremely friable, and the highs and lows of a British summer saw Cambridge record the hottest national day on record. This did mean the mud rock dried quickly, until the lows of a British summer created humid conditions which meant the mud rock wouldn't dry at all. The soil blocks also tended to crumble from beneath the mud rock, losing the stratigraphic context. In the end, the best method was to place the sample buckets in which the blocks had to fit over the top of the cut-out block and gently tip the bucket over. There were some casualties. The picture on the left shows a block that was cut down too close to the experiment, causing it to collapse. In the red circle, you can see the ochre-covered bones poking through the top of the soil. Where samples collapsed, the soil and bones were collected in a sample tub, which enabled later analysis of the bones. In the end, I was able to successfully collect at least one block from each variable, with 2 blocks for those excavated using the second extraction technique. The analysis, much like the excavation, involved a lot of problem solving. The image on the screen is of a CT scan of one of the blocks containing ochre and fur. The black patch in the red circle was a void created by the hair or fur and the ochre. This reduced the density of the block, enabling a good image resolution. The problem was that the bone and skin samples did not have a void, and so the scans just came out as a dense, blurry mass. The images recently produced using the phase contrast synchrotron microtomography could potentially yield better results. Unfortunately, this was not available. So thin slicing became the main method for processing. The problem with this is that the blocks were too big, so they had to be excavated down to size without disturbing the stratigraphy. Show the processing stages. Once again, this required a bit of educated guesswork as to the orientation of the bone within the block in order to get the best slices. On the left is the block impregnated with resin. The middle image shows the block once it had had a few slices removed, and the right shows a slice ready for grinding down. As you can see in these photos, the ochre shows up beautifully. Here we can see the bottom of the grave cut, with the bone cut through the transverse plane. Here is a void created by the soft tissue decomposition, and a substantial amount of ochre here on the right, and here lying beside the base of the cut, and a few pieces having shifted between the two lower limb bones. Observations. The thin slices show that fur and hair samples create a void. Where the hair and fur take longer to decompose, it enables the ochre to linger around in the soil for longer. This wasn't observed on the bone and skin samples. The ochre appears to have washed away through the sediment. I was in the middle of processing my samples in March 2020 when the lab was forced to shut due to the global pandemic. So my ongoing work includes thin slice preparation, thin slice comparison, geochemical soil analysis, and then potentially I'd like to compare different binders and different soil types, and perhaps attempt a traditional excavation to see the ochre staining in plan. I'm really hopeful that I'll be able to resume this work very soon. Thank you very much for your attention. I would like to thank EXARC and its organisers and the following people and institutions for their support and assistance in this research.